Hello, Infiniteers. Today I want to address a common question that seems to come up over and over again in various toy box discussions, and that is, how can I save memory when I am building in the toy box? And people ask this question in a lot of different ways. Some people have been watching me long enough to know that I play on a Wii U, and they will ask me how I am able to build such huge worlds filled with missions and games on a Wii U, one of the consoles that has the least amount of memory. Or I will see toy box discussions on the Discord or on Reddit where someone is trying to build a toy box and they keep filling up their memory and they do not understand why, and they're asking for help. Well, I covered the memory meter back in episode 7, and again, the memory meter is the little colorful stick on the right side of the screen. And I also gave some general tips for how to save memory in that video. There is also an episode of Toy Box TV Tips and Tricks that talks about how to save memory, so if you have not yet seen either of those videos, I recommend that you go watch them. Those videos may help you out, and I will put a link to them in the video description. But neither of those videos gets into a lot of specific detail about how toy box memory works and what specific things you can do to save memory, so I want to cover that today. Now, before we start, I want to caveat this by saying that I did not work on Disney Infinity, okay? I am a fan just like you, so I do not have any first-hand knowledge about the game code or how it works. But I was a software developer for many years before I retired, and I know how memory works, and I can make some pretty educated guesses about what the Disney Infinity engine is doing based on my experience and based on what I can observe about the game when I'm working in the toy box editor and I see the memory meter going up and down. So let's start with how toy box memory, or how memory, works in a game like this. Every object that you can place in the toy box has a corresponding model. The model is like a template or a pattern. A model consists of the vertices and polygons that form the 3D shape of the object, as well as the textures that are applied to the surface of the object. If the game code was written using an object-oriented language, which I think for Disney Infinity it was, then the model will also contain the behavior and algorithms associated with that object. This can include AI, if the object is an enemy or a townsperson, animation rigs, physics models, collision detection, and so on. So when we drop an object into the game, for example, like this enemy, we are actually loading two things into memory. First, the game loads the model for this object, and then it uses the model to create an instance of that object. The model goes into what I would call the invisible part of the memory. It's something the game needs, but you don't see it in your world, but it still takes up memory. What you do see is the object that was created from that model. That goes into what I call the visible memory. Now, watch the memory meter on the right, okay, and notice how long it takes to drop the first enemy. That delay is because the game was loading the model for that object, and it was obviously a big model because it took a long time to load, and it caused the memory meter to jump pretty significantly. But notice what happens when I drop a second enemy of the same type. That enemy appeared much quicker, and the memory meter did not jump like it did for the first enemy. And that's because the model for this enemy was already loaded into memory, so all the game had to do was create another instance of it. You can think of the model like a rubber stamp. Once you have it, you can just stamp it multiple times to get multiple copies of that object. So right now, we have one model and a bunch of instances of this object. Let me go ahead and just delete all but two. Okay, So we have one model and two enemies loaded into memory. And you can see where the memory meter is on the right. And that's actually not the top little peg there. That's the middle one. Of course, I'm not including the big terrain piece that they're standing on, because obviously we have a model and an instance of that too. But ignoring the terrain, basically we have three things loaded into memory. One enemy model and two instances of that enemy. And look where the memory meter is. Okay, let's delete one enemy. Okay, and let's put down a second enemy of a different type. Okay, again, watch the memory meter on the right and notice how long it takes to drop a second enemy this time. The memory meter took another jump, and it took a moment to drop this second enemy into the toy box. And that's because this new enemy is based off a different model, so we had to load its model into memory before we could create him in the toy box. Now, if you could look into the memory, here's what you would find. You have two models loaded into the memory now, which you can't see, and you have two enemies, which you do see. So just like before, we have two enemies in our toy box, but this time we're using more memory because we have two models loaded into the memory instead of one, because we have two different kinds of enemies. Now, the enemy models are pretty big because, again, there's a lot of overhead associated with them. You've got the AI, animation rigs, collision detection, and all of that. But every object in the toy box works the same way, okay? So every building piece, every bit of terrain, every plant, every creativity toy, every vehicle, every mount, every object has its own model. Some models take up more memory than others. These models, for example, take up much more memory than a basic terrain block here, like this one. But every time you add a new building piece to your toy box that you haven't used yet, the game loads another model into the invisible part of your memory. So the first tip that I would give you is to limit the variety of objects in your toy box. If you want to save memory and maximize the amount of memory that you use for the visible part of your world, the first way to do that is to limit the number of models that the game needs to load. And the way you do that is by limiting the variety of the objects that you use. So, for example, do you really need 4 different trees in your toy box, each of them using their own different model? Or, instead of doing that, use one model and just rotate the tree. Like that. You see, the tree looks different from every side, and so that gives you the variety that you may want, but now you only have one model loaded into the memory instead of 4. Now, obviously, a tree model takes up a lot less memory than an enemy model like these guys, okay? And because I know that because how fast the tree loaded into memory, and because the memory meter didn't jump like it did for the enemies. A tree doesn't have AI or physics, and it may not have animation, so it makes sense that the tree model is smaller. So limiting variety is good, but if you're going to save the most memory, or you want to save the most memory, you're going to do that by reducing the variety of objects that have the largest models. So the second tip I would give you is to focus your efforts on the objects that use the most memory first. Objects that have the largest models and take up the most memory are enemies, critters, townspeople, vehicles, physics balls, collectibles, destructible objects, like most of the objects in the decorations drawer, and some gameplay toys, and other interactive objects like creativity toys, platforming toys, racetrack pieces, especially banked curves and loops, customizable plants, customizable buildings, like the ones from Disney Infinity 1.0 from those playsets, and some buildings and set pieces that contain buttons or rail slides. Also, any building piece that has animation, like the terrain pieces that have water, or building pieces like these that have moving parts, will have larger models as well. Now, obviously, sometimes you want to use objects that have larger models, and that's fine. Just understand the trade-offs. You can use them, but they're going to take up more memory than others, which means you may have to give something else up in order to use them. But the point here is to focus your efforts first on the things that use up the most memory. Don't worry about adjusting your terrain to reduce the number of terrain models you're using from 30 to 20 if you're using 10 different kinds of enemies in your battles. You would save much more memory by changing your battles to use 2 or 3 different enemies instead of 10. Do that first, and then see if you need to save more memory by adjusting your terrain, because the odds are if you deal with the things that use the most memory first, then you won't have to deal with things that don't take up as much memory. Alright, tip number 3. Dynamically add and remove objects that use the most memory. Another way to save memory is to only add memory-intensive objects when they're needed and remove them when they are no longer needed. Enemies, townspeople, and critters have the largest models, so don't just drop a bunch of them directly into your toy box and let them wander around. If it's possible, the player may not even be in that area to interact with them. That just wastes a lot of memory. Instead, use a dynamic trigger to set up a zone in your toy box, and use an enemy wave generator or a friendly wave generator to add the townspeople or enemies when the player enters that zone, and remove them when the player leaves that zone. I've shown how to do that in a lot of different toy box videos, but one of the most recent was in episode 20 of my Zootopia series. The second half of that video shows how to set up townsperson zones around the city. Physics balls take up a lot of memory too, but you can use a falling object generator to dynamically add and remove physics balls from your world as needed, and I covered the falling object generator back in Toy Box Tutorials episode 60. For vehicles, you can use vehicle summoners to dynamically add and remove those, and I covered the vehicle summoner back in episode 69. For collectibles and destructible objects, you can use a replayer to dynamically add and remove those from your toy box, and I covered the replayer back in episode 28. Tip number 4. Limit the physical dimensions of your toy box. Now, this one isn't quite so obvious, but one of the things that I've noticed is that the larger your toy box is physically, the more memory it uses, because it takes more objects to fill it up. So we'll start here in an empty toy box, and I'm going to use the exact same block that we already have loaded to start with. Okay? So we have one model, which is the simplest and smallest of the models there is in terms of memory. And right now we just have one instance of this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill in the entire possible dimensions of the toy box. Because one of the things the developers did is they put a cap on the physical dimensions of the toy box. So you can only build so far in any direction. Okay, so if we build in this direction, for example, eventually we hit the edge of the toy box world and we can't go any further that way. And it's basically 10 objects in that direction. And the same in this direction. So we go 10 objects in this direction, and we hit the boundary of the world here. Okay? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a perimeter around the toy box, and then I'm going to fill it in with all of these objects. So there'd be a lot of objects, but there's only one loaded in memory. And we'll show you how big the world is that you can make and how much memory it takes up. So let me do that, and I'll be back in just a moment. Okay, so here we are. I have filled the entire toy box with these blocks, and I have also placed one on each end to give you a sense of the size of this. So basically it's a 21 by 21 grid of these blocks, okay, which comes out to 442 of these blocks. And add 2 more because I stuck one on each end sticking up. So we have 444 blocks, okay? We have one model, but 444 instances of it. And I want you to look at how much memory we're using on the memory meter. I have basically used a third, almost, of my toy box memory, and all I have done is just covered the surface of my toy box in terrain. There are no decorations, there are no buildings, there is nothing here but terrain. And look at the amount of memory that it's taking up. That's insane. What that tells me, though, is that the memory usage is not just about the variety and the number of objects that you're using in the toy box and the size of their models. It's also about how physically big you make your toy box, okay? So if you want to save memory, another way to do that is to make your toy box as small as possible. Don't make a big sprawling toy box if you don't really need it. Again, if you want a big sprawling toy box, you can do that, but the trade-off is you may not have enough memory left to add a lot of detail or gameplay. But that may be fine in some settings. For example, my Pride Lands toy box for Mickey's Safari was a huge toy box, but that setting doesn't really need a lot of plants or decorations. The same is true for the desert toy box in my Aladdin adventure. It's mostly rolling terrain with a few decorations here and there, so a large toy box in those settings may be fine. And the space battle in my Star Wars Screams in the Void series took place in a huge toy box, but the toy box was mostly empty space. So even though the physical dimensions of that toy box were huge, it didn't take up much memory because it was mostly empty. So tip number 5 would be to break up your huge world into smaller worlds. If you do want a huge sprawling world filled with as much detail as possible, but you can't fit it all in one toy box, then consider breaking your world up into smaller toy boxes connected by toy box stores. That's what I did with my recreation of Disneyland. Main Street USA is one toy box, Fantasyland is another toy box, Frontierland is another, Adventureland is another, and Tomorrowland is another. And I used toy box stores to transport the player from one area of the park to another. I covered toy box stores back in episodes 30 and 64, so if you're not familiar with toy box stores, you can go back and watch those episodes. But this technique breaks the large world up into smaller areas, which saves memory and allows me to add all kinds of little details and games and rides into each area. It may not be the ideal solution, but it works. Well, I hope my memory saving tips in this tutorial were helpful for you. If so, please give this video a like and leave a comment to let me know. One last thing I should say before I wrap this video up, and that is that you might be thinking you don't see these kinds of drastic memory meter jumps on your system like I do on my Wii U, and that may be true because you probably have more memory than I do. I have the Deluxe Wii U with 32 gigabytes of memory, which is a lot for a Wii U, but it's still less than most other systems. So maybe you think you don't need these memory saving tips because your system has a lot of memory. Well, The memory meter jumps may be more noticeable on my Wii U, but your system's memory is still limited too. You may have more than I do, but you still only have so much. So no matter what system you're on, these tips are still going to be useful for you in helping you to maximize your memory so that you can build the kind of toy box world you want. Anyway, that's all for me today. If you have a question about a toy that I haven't covered, or about how to do something in the toy box, let me know that in the comments below. I may make a tutorial for it, or I may point you to an existing video that already shows how to do that. But either way, I'll try to help you out. Thank you for watching, and have a great weekend.